Welcome to today's webinar, Avoiding RPA Disaster with Test Automation. So without further ado, let me introduce our host. As I said, my name is Mark Lambert. I'm the Vice President of Products at Parasoft, and I'm joined by Diego. Diego, I always say your last name terribly, so I'm going to actually hand over to you and let you do your own introduction, say your last name.
Thank you very much, Mark. Yeah, I know my last name is a bit challenging, but anyway, it's Giudice, just in case people really want to hear what it is. But thank you very much, Mark, for the opportunity, and thank you guys, Parasoft, and to have me.
Yeah, so thank you. So the first thing, let's do a quick poll. RPA has a lot of buzz in the industry right now. And certainly as we're talking to different clients, and obviously Diego, as you're talking to your clients as well, the question of RPA comes up, question around RPA resilience comes up a lot as well. So we'd like to run a quick poll. You'll notice here that there's varying levels of answer. So nothing where we don't test RPA at all, we just do and deploy. Second option, we test in production. Basically, once you've deployment, you do some sanitation tests in your actual live production environment. You run some smoke tests pre-deployment, so it going into production runs. Or the last on the testing options, that you have a rigorous or disciplined testing approach. Now, the last option here on the list as well is, as we know with conversations with a lot of folks, we noticed that RPA is a hot topic. Many people are looking to do it, but many people are not actually doing it yet. So if you're just interested in RPA today and you're trying to get a grasp as to what's going on in the market, go ahead and click that last option that says we are not doing RPA yet. So we'll just give it a couple more moments and let the poll run to conclusion. Okay, and let's see what the results look like. Okay, interesting. So what we've got here, so of the number one choice is we are not doing RPA yet. That's actually not a surprise to me. I'm actually, it's reaffirming one of my thoughts on the whole RPA thing. Diego, do you want to comment on this? Diego, you're able to...
I was muted. I think it depends on the audience, because RPA, as we will hear in a minute, is something that business people tend to do. So I guess if we have more of an IT technical audience, those responses make sense. Also because IT often doesn't get involved.
Yeah, so I think it's going to be an interesting conversation for folks today, getting familiar with what the drivers for RPA are, what the risks associated with it is. Also, it did seem that we had like a sliding scale going from not testing RPA all the way down to testing, having a rigorous approach. So I think that kind of also reaffirms some of the things that we've been talking about as well. Now, with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into it. You should be able to control the PowerPoint slides now.
Okay.
There we go. It says you have control of screen, so you should be able to, there you go, you're clicking forward.
Oops, I don't see the arrows anymore, but I guess I can still move. Okay, great, wonderful. All right, well, thanks again, Mark. Yeah, so basically, you know, there's three things that I want to discuss in my piece here, and this is it, right? So it's why testing and test automation are critical for implementing RPA at scale. So it is true, RPA is there's lots of hype around it, but really the hype is more about lots of people have been, let me say, playing around with it or doing some sort of automation, but to really scale, right? Yeah, my feeling and our feeling, the research is showing that probably, you know, it needs to be a bit more systematic, and testing is going to be a big part of that. But there's also some, as you will see, there's kind of an overlap, because, you know, I hear, you know, Parasoft and other vendors saying, oh, we have clients that are that would like to use the test tool for doing and writing some RPA. And I see this here, the same similar thing from the RPA folks saying, oh, maybe we could do some testing with our tools. So I'm going to try and clarify that a bit. But the area I really want to focus on is how to test RPA, right? And what does it mean in order, which is going to be a very important step if RPA is going to scale as it looks like it will. So let's start with the first point. Well, I guess given that many of you seem to be new to RPA, it made sense to answer this question. It looks like we kind of thought we were gonna have to kind of give a little bit of introduction, at least of common ground setting on what we mean by RPA and what the industry means by RPA. This is not, this is kind of an informal definition that basically shows that the R of RPA stands for robotic, and it means, an entity or something that has a capability, which is basically a, piece of code, or people call them bots, but an entity that is capable of mimicking human actions. P stands for a sequence process, and it means, a sequence of steps for an activity or a task, right? That's how we define formally what a process is. A process is made of activities, is made of a series of steps and tasks or activities that we need to achieve. And A stands for automation, robotic process automation. Automation is, well, those tasks, those processes, those activities, those steps are happening automatically, meaning there is no human intervention. Now, for test automation guys, this kind might sound familiar, and you're right. You should think it is familiar. But here you have an example of what a process might look like. That is a robotic process example. So basically, you've got a bot that can log into an application. It can navigate into the submenus. It can access paginated tables with thousands of records. It can grab the required data, copy that data to Excel, prepare the data, group it, by bank or by incident or by depending what the business application is, send emails to managers, and then the next morning somebody will find all these nice reports, what was achieved overnight. So what are the dynamics that I'm seeing in the market? Well, actually there is, as I said, I already kind of mentioned, test vendors that claim, oh, we can, we have RPA capabilities. We actually had them for years. The RPA vendors are now claiming that they do have test automation capabilities. Their point is, if I can automate a process, right? Testing is a process. I can automate the process of testing, and then you've got you've got the possibility of using RPA for testing. You've got the possibility of using test tools for RPA. But what I'm really interested in, and I want to focus on a bit more, is, well, how about that overlap, that intersection? We will look at it, right? We'll take a look at what I see being true or not. But can we test RPA, and how do we test RPA, and do we test RPA? Right, that's the topic. And do we need to test RPA? And if so, how do we do that? So, well, I guess let's build the case of why we might need to build RPA. Well, as some of you, if you're currently, if you've done RPA, your experience, this wouldn't sound unfamiliar to you, because there are many reasons why RPA often fails in organizations, and it's many things. Here are 3 points that I just wanted to summarize quickly. One is, there's an underestimation of what are the complete technology components, and quite often people get hung up by, oh, we need to choose the right technology first, instead of maybe selecting the right process that can be and should be automated. And sometimes when they choose the right process, they underestimate that they might need, they might underestimate or forget that there's a step where they might need a very special OCR image recognition system, because maybe in the process they need to recognize an invoice or they might a signature or a check, and have to make a payment. The other reason is around change management, lack of IT involvement. I could have called this more general, lack of IT involvement, because what we see happening is lots of RPA, small applications, simple steps get automated, and it's all done almost directly in production, which is kind of scary if you think about it, especially for us as a testing community. But that's what's happening, right? Many implementations, and people focus, less. People focus less on an overall design, and they get focused on getting hundreds and thousands of bots up and running and people dive headfirst into the software configuration, neglecting the preliminary step of step design. Of course, that's because they don't have maybe architects getting involved, IT is not getting involved. There's a big issue on change management. There is no change management process. People just change something, and the whole resiliency of the overall process automation fails. And then part of that concept of IT not getting involved, not just for security, but in general, as I said, there is no real strong software development lifecycle process that we are used to, meaning that there is no formal testing done, no rigorous testing. Now, and that's actually what we want to, of course, focus on and talk about today. And as you can see, right, even in this statement by a VP of Engineering of Divi Cloud, Scott Totman, I just liked what he said. It's like, it fails in two scenarios. One is because the process being automated is not the right one, as I mentioned a minute ago. But if you read what's in the red text, it's all about testing, I would say, because what happens to these bots running in production, because there was no testing, because there was no regression testing done, basically, if something changes around those bots, they just fail. They just will, and an incident will happen, right? That to me sounds like very much lack of testing. The other important, the last two points about this is that, there's a big issue around resiliency. It's hard to keep the bots running, as I mentioned, in production, either after an incident, but even making just a small change will cause an incident, causes quite often an incident. And companies are deploying, those that are deploying RPA, they're deploying thousands of bots, and they really struggle with resiliency. So keeping the bots running in production and providing value after an incident is a big problem. They deploy them with no real testing. There's no automated testing, no regression built. And they, basically when they change and redeploy, disaster happens. And the maintenance of the bots themselves, as I mentioned a minute ago, there is no design of the automated process to interlink back into the existing control points. And basically that's just as important, if not more, than configuring the actual implementation to the specific steps of requirements of implementing a workflow. So resiliency, bot maintenance is a big issue. And why do we care about this? Well, it's because, of course, behind all this, there is business revenue loss. This is business people implementing some operational steps. Imagine, you can think of an insurance, and actually there is, insurance companies that are using RPA to do some clerical work to replace people doing clerical work that would be shifted elsewhere. And there's revenue tied to that, and fixing in production can be quite expensive too, right? If you're only using, think about tons of little bots and scripts running in production and starting to fail. And that also creates, of course, huge business risk, right? So I just find that it's really interesting to see how lightly the requirement of testing in RPA has been. And I guess there's a justification to that. One is we're doing simple things yet. When you start looking at more complex at scale RPA, I think this becomes a very serious problem. So let's now address a little bit this confusion, or at least this double claim from parties from the two different markets that RPA is you know, the RPA folks claiming, oh, we have a lot of automation stuff, and the testing companies saying the same. So what we did is, this is actually a piece of work of a report that I'm about to publish. And guess what? Of course, I worked with an RPA analyst, my dear friend Craig Leclerc. We came up with these kind of Venn diagram, right? And so bear with me if it's not totally complete, but I think it captures most of the you know, points we want to make in terms of what continuous test automation tools do versus RPA platforms and what they have in common. So, of course, you know, you probably know this list very well, because I am assuming you know, we have more of a development and testing background on the call. But, you know, failure analysis, we do packaged application, business process testing. In testing, we've been doing automated simulation, service virtualization. We'll be talking more about that. Omni-channel testing, the capability of testing, you know, on web browsers, on mobile devices, on any type of channel, you know, even voice channels like assistants. And we do have platforms that execute the automation, the environment, the test execution environment is something that, you know, continuous test automation tools will have. There's also been test management, the tools that help you manage the test process, overall, you know, get good quality reporting from an overall perspective, application quality and analytics reporting using AI and machine learning, and non-functional testing, the other very important thing, not just functional testing, unit testing, but we also are capable of doing, in the testing world, performance testing, security testing. And the tools enable now, you know, to run tests within a continuous integration, continuous delivery tools. And some of them offer, of course, development features, a development view of the tools that allow you to use and build testing within, you know, within the CI/CD, within the IDE for developers. Now, the RPA platforms on their side have a bunch of features that you can see here, right? They have very strong security, credential management in production, and they deal with, you know, process complexity at scale. We can debate if the process complexity that we deal with, you know, are as complex, you know, if the ones we deal with in testing are as similarly as complex, but they say, you know, they claim basically that they're doing enterprise scale process automation. At least that's the capability that these tools often have. Control tower reporting, bot lifecycle management. They run these thousands of bots, and they, you know, have to kind of know which bots are up and running. The payment is the way these tools get paid is around you know, is basically by user bot, and you know, they've got also process task and discovery, process mining, content data handling, task completions. These are you know, these are common, let's say, important features and others that these RPA tools have. And so what do they have in common? Well, they have quite a bit in common, it looks like, right? Both of the environments are running and integrating AI and machine learning. In the robotic process automation world, they call service automation is what we do in the testing tools in terms of UI level test automation at the API level, object recognition, image recognition, orchestration and scheduling of process execution. We do that also through when I say we, I'm always referring to testing, right? The test side of the world. Also using, of course, CI/CD tools, but that's kind of something that probably they're still working on. Automation, analytics, and reporting, bug fixing support, some level of self-healing. I think this is limited on both sides, you know, things like locate. We've seen, you know, on the UI testing with Selenium, for example, we're capable of fixing locators. They do something very similar. The versioning and assets managing of automation in terms of you know, versioned assets so that we can easily reuse the automation. And then both of the environments have authoring tools and design automation tools. Is again a similar, you know, similar things on both sides. The RPA folks might say, well, but ours are probably more easy to use because our tools are used entirely, mostly by you know, by so-called citizen developers or business developers, and probably they're right. But I would say, claim that, you know, also test tools have served different testing personas. But what is important as a conclusion on this, though, is that the overlap is not fixed, right? So this more or less reflects the situation in the market, but it really depends on the test tool or the RPA platform that you're using to find, you know, how many of these capabilities might shift into one domain versus the other, right? So, so it depends which test tool, you know, you have and you own. You'll see more overlap or less overlap. So let's focus now on, with that clarification, you know, the point I would like to focus on is, what is it that we can, you know, what does testing have to offer to the RPA world, right? And especially when you want to scale RPA. All right, so basically testing can offer, you know, we are the tools and the technology and the skills that, that we have on the testing side is something that can be leveraged all the way through any RPA workflow. And whether it's testing the specific components, whether it's testing the workflow that's orchestrating the execution or the repeat of a process, that can be dealt as an application and it can be tested, right? And the integration of all this happening is something that typically we could do with the testing tools. And what testing and testers can bring to the table, this goes beyond automation, is obviously the quality discipline and mindset, right? That we have on the testing world, that we've developed over more than 30 years of experience, maturing testing practices. Even that manual testing expertise that we have is useful, because not everything is going to be, not everything is automated, and actually some of the processes also have manual steps sometimes, and not everything that needs to be done is manual. But there's lots of know-how that's coming from the world of testing, both manual and automation, and really what we do in testing is preventing issues from happening rather than chasing them at runtime in production. So I guess it's of course we've got this mindset of preventing and testing on pre-production rather than doing it in production. And of course a wealth of technical and business automation testing expertise that can be very, very useful for testing RPA. But out of everything that we do, I would say from the testing world that I pick and think that is looking at the two sides of the coin, the RPA and the testing, I think these are the three most important areas where there's differentiation and where I would still think that RPA lack, and would benefit much more from testing. It's the non-functional testing piece of testing, especially the load and speed performance, right? So we know how to not only do functional testing, but we also can run performance tests on the functionality, load and speed. There's the automated integration automation that we can do, and simulation with service utilization. And there is functional test automation at scale. So let me just spend a few minutes on these three, I would say, differentiating aspects that make testing, I think, a very strong companion to that fast-growing, RPA market. So talking about load and speed performance, I'm using, this is just a graphic from a report that I published at the end of last year, which shows basically load and speed performance, the ecosystem of capabilities and functionality that, that the tools on the testing side bring to bear for testing. And actually this is for shift-left performance testing, which is shifting performance testing more during development, design development, than doing it in production, of course, which is I think something that the RPA folks should leverage. We should leverage on the RPA side. You can see that it's a very, you know, rich ecosystem of application, performance monitoring types of tools, code profiling tools, service utilization tools, and shift-left performance testing tools that have the core capabilities. The core capabilities are what you see here on the left on the rows. So on the, you know, in the rows, and you know, so things like the capability of measuring speed performance with and without load, the capability of creating specific performance test scripts, the capability of generating load testing data for running performance testing. The you know, code profiling tools would give you capabilities to identify anti-patterns during development. Analytics and reporting, mocking and stubbing. Service utilization is actually for a more complete and a more, let's say, deeper type of performance testing. You know, mocking and stubbing service utilization becomes very critical, and so that's part of the ecosystem of shift-left performance testing, integrating CI/CD, API performance testing, you know, basic synthetic test creator. These are all, you know, very important capabilities that could be leveraged to test the performance of an RPA and a subset of the RPA of the entire RPA. So let's shift to the simulation and integration automation. So this is the process we talked about in a minute, and you can read the definition if you want. That's the formal definition I gave a few years back to service utilization, but I'm going to explain it graphically. So basically what could happen is that this process, you know, basically might be happening, you know, on a distributed environment where you have a mainframe and where, you know, those thousands of records that we are accessing are running on a mainframe. On the other hand, maybe the system that is helping you prepare, mining the data, grouping the data, and being able to do all the massage of the data that you need to do might be running on a cloud. Now, if you'd want to do testing, right, your operations folks are not going to allow you easily to kind of go on the mainframe and do your testing in production. Definitely there, you know, might not, you won't get that permission. And actually, if you get a window opportunity to access the mainframe to do testing, you're even lucky. But what you can do instead with, you know, with service utilization tools is you can virtualize that, those two steps with a virtual service, right, which are simulating as if it was running on the mainframe in production and as if the virtual service is running on the cloud and doing the preparation of data. So you can actually test the workflow even with, you know, very complicated pieces and have an idea of what's going to happen once this gets deployed into production, because you can mimic, for example, the virtual service being very slow, going faster, you know, integrated with performance. So in other words, we can do a much more complete testing with service utilization in a complex environment that you can't do without service utilization. And sometimes probably the RPA guys don't do this type of testing because they don't have the, you know, not all of them have these capabilities, and actually many of them don't. So my last part on the functional test automation at scale. What is it that we can bring to the RPA world for testing from the test side? Well, first of all, you know, we have a good practice of creating reusable and repeatable assets, test scenarios, use cases, but even the automation, the scripts, making them reusable to run them over and over, right? That's something that they don't do with RPA. Regression testing to limit change disasters. Well, we mentioned, right, that case of things changing around the bot and the bot suddenly failing. Well, you know, with regression testing, you can limit those disasters because you can if some change happens, you want to make sure that the environment is still stable, and so the change won't affect the surrounding environment and have it crash. We've also got some interesting, technologies, let me call it, like domain-specific languages, like, think about Gherkin, think about, Cucumber Gherkin, or think about the different DSLs that the tools might be, that each tool comes along with, that, and that's advantages because that DSL will be will make it much more easy to collaborate across the business, across testers or developers. Now, the reason why this is important is because remember what we're trying to do, and we're going to be doing, I think, going forward, is to convince the RPA guys that if they really want to scale RPA, they're going to have to, the software development lifecycle has to become a bit more rigorous. And some of that has to be done earlier, can be done earlier on, avoid disasters in production, and IT needs to get involved. And so things like a domain-specific language for testing will be very important. And shift left, of course, shift left, not just, here it's about the whole shift left of testing, which will support a more disciplined software development lifecycle for RPA. The level of analytics and reporting that is done by the tools in terms of quality at the team level, at the practitioner, so before you deploy into production, but also for business or for executives, right? What's the level of quality and monitoring that in production? And, very specific reporting and analytics around quality. The capabilities, context for analyzing bugs and triaging the bugs and reducing the time it might take to fix a bug, especially right now that they're deploying directly into production. The RPA, the longer it's off, the bots are down, the bigger is going to be the impact for the business. So reducing mean time to repair with the tools that we have to create the context of the bug happening and recreating the capability of recreating the context in, for the developers to quickly look and find the bugs is going to be important. And last but not least, and this is looking a little bit more forward, right? Where automation is becoming more generically an important service for any big enterprise. And the world of automation, right, is basically made of a number of different both technologies and service providers, right? You've got service providers that are implementing automation for and with end users. You've got automation platform providers like the IBMs, the IP, the Wipros, and that can help you build even AI. They've got AI platforms, they've got broader platforms on which you can build applications. You've got the continuous delivery and release automation tools that provide automation capabilities for automating development. The RPA guys, and I say, if you download the research, you won't find test automation there. That's a change I'm going to push to my colleagues, is test automation vendors and the test automation technology should be part of this picture as well. So all of these will help scale automation at an enterprise level. I think this goes beyond just testing. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Mark.
Great, thank you very much, Diego. So I think we've got a really good business case here for why testing of RPA is important, and why we need a test for RPA resilience. And there are some, there are some challenges with RPA, and to kind of reinforce some of the things that Diego was just talking about. The RPA is kind of like a shadow IT deployment within many organizations. It lacks that formalized software development process that Diego was just talking about. And for those that have been software developers or professional software development, or worked in professional software development organizations, they know that software development isn't easy. People have, I personally have 2 degrees specifically around computer science to really become aware of the subtleties of understanding the challenges associated with doing software development. Now, it's very easy and quick to create bots within RPA, especially the simple ones, but often they don't consider the unexpected scenarios or all of the different workflows that can go through. And there are, as we said, very limited number of controls to handle when the bot goes out of control and it starts operating outside of the parameters that we're expecting. Also, what we need to be thinking about is that there's an ongoing amount of change within the environment that you're implementing your RPA workflow. This really does come down to the number one failure and the number one pitfall associated with RPA disasters. Things change under your feet. They change without you knowing, and they change outside of your control. This isn't just the UI, although people will focus on the UIs changing quite extensively. It's also the data, it's the environment itself. And you can actually make your RPA workflows be more resilient through the use of less UI-centric workflows and more API-centric. But a lot of those legacy applications still have old UIs. And what you need to do is to look to areas where you can, in essence, reduce that complexity so that the robots can more easily handle the change and easily take that into account. So how we kind of make sure that we overcome these challenges, obviously, as Diego made the case, is by introducing testing and leveraging test automation where possible. But testing isn't free. Certainly, it's going to be very quick to create a simple RPA bot, but then to create tests that cover all of the use cases and all of the scenarios is going to cost time, and it's going to therefore cost money and assignment of resources within the organization. So you really need to assess what the risk is associated with your RPA process and when you should do testing of that RPA process. So if I think about a two-dimensional grid, if I think about the complexity of my RPA process, and I think about that from the point of view of how complex the workflow is, the number of external dependencies I have, because those external dependencies represent a significant risk of change, as well as outages or undefined behavior. The percentage of UI-centric components within my workflow. As I said, UI is a lot less resilient to change than programmatic APIs. And also the complexity of my data relationships within my workflow. If I think of my complexity, and then on my other axis, I'm thinking about my business risk. It's the cost of failure. So failure could be that the process doesn't work, but it could be that the process does the wrong thing. If I've got a bot scaled for thousands of, processing thousands of accounts or thousands of transactions, and that is off just a few dollars, I can cost the company millions of dollars within minutes. So the cost of the bot, in essence, going out of control or failing, it would be obviously the first issue. The second issue would be cost of outage. What happens when the bot goes offline and I'm not able to handle the processes, I'm not the transactions? When that bot goes offline, is there a manual process that backs it up? And if there is, how often am I having to jump back to that manual backup? Scale of execution, I touched upon this a second ago. If you're talking about an RPA process that's just processing 1 or 2 transactions a day, it's not that big of a deal. If you're talking about something that's processing thousands every hour or every minute, then you've got a much bigger problem and a much higher risk. In fact, there was one case study that I was reading about where an accounting firm implemented an RPA process to migrate information from one system to another, migrating some of their account ledger data. And due to a mistake in the RPA process, not being able to take into account some strange characters in somebody's last name, because it was tested within the US market, but not validated within an international market, that caused the RPA workflow to catastrophically fail and in essence wipe over all of the data that was in the transferred system. So that kind of scale is an issue. And that actually ties into compliance as well. It's often one of those things that people don't consider when they're thinking about RPA is, do I have any regulatory compliance that I need to be careful about here? The obvious one is GDPR, but you also have PII and also HIPAA as well for healthcare information in the US. So all of these represent two axes that we need to look at and assess when we should do test automation. The simple answer to start with is there are some things you don't need to do test automation on. Anything that is of low business risk, you are wasting your company's money if you're going to start testing those. However, conversely, there are some things that you should not be using RPA for. If you've got something that's highly complex and represents a high business risk, probably not the best candidate for an RPA process, which is why we often see many RPA implementations today kind of focusing on the more the simpler, less risky things. Your sweet spot when it comes to test automation are those things which are kind of in the medium level of complexity and medium to high business risk. This is really where your happy place is. This is where you want to be spending time and spending resources to do test automation. Now, what makes good test automation? What are the three key elements that I need to do to ensure that I can have predictable, reliable testing when it comes to my RPA resilience? These three break down into three things: predictability, visibility, and repeatability. So I'm looking to make sure, first of all, that my test is predictable, meaning that if I have an RPA workflow, that I'm able to validate and assert that when I put in a data value, a particular input has an appropriate response or output. I want to make sure those tests are stable, because if the tests are unstable, they're basically useless. You can't rely upon them. So I need to be able to make sure that the same inputs have the same outputs or the same outcomes when it comes to my RPA workflow. The second thing I need to consider around stability is that of my test environment. It's not just my robot that I'm testing. So this workflow here represents the robot. It's the dependencies that that robot's talking to. Internal databases, external cloud services. Maybe I'm talking to my a different part of my organization, the accounting part or the warehouse fulfillment. This is where I need to take into account my overall test environment. And then I also need to consider the boundary conditions. So while my previous icons had identified that I tested each of the outcomes, it hadn't taken into consideration the internal factors of the workflow. And how do I control the behavior of that internal workflow? This is where I start isolating my external dependencies and simulating the different scenarios with service virtualization that Diego was talking about earlier to simulate that behavior. The next thing I need to do is to make sure that my tests are visible, meaning I have visibility into how the tests are performed. But it's not just visibility into the outcome of the process. I need visibility to what's going on inside the workflow. I need to be able to understand that the data that's communicating between my dependent steps is the data that I'm expecting. Because if something disruptive or some change happens in an external system, I need to be able to validate that my workflow is not impacted. And then what I also want to be able to do is to validate what's going on within, not just within the system by listening to things like queues or topics or enterprise service buses, but I also want to be able to validate what's going on with my external data sources, things like database or log files, so I can interrogate and make sure my workflow is doing the same thing today that I'd expect that it did yesterday as part of my automation. And then the last thing is the tests need to be repeatable, meaning that I need to be able to take into account changes within my workflow, not just changes within maybe the UI of the system that I'm interacting with, but also the changes with those external systems. So I need to be able to do validation to make sure that those external systems are behaving correctly. And I need to be able to continuously execute these test scenarios, both in a stage environment as well as within a production environment. So I want to do my exhaustive testing, my potentially destructive testing in some kind of stage environment, but I do want to continuously run non-destructive smoke tests within a production environment to have validation that the workflows are still working correctly and that the environment is not changing under my feet and impacting my workflow negatively. Now, once I've got a reliable test automation in place, the thing that Diego was mentioning a few moments ago, which is scale, becomes really important. Do I know that my robot is going to work when I turn the dial up to 11? Here, what we want to be able to do is to reuse those test scenarios that I've already created. So I'm not reworking and I'm not having to engage yet another team to do early stage validation of my performance. I want to reuse my scenarios that I created earlier. And then I'm going to want to be able to synthetically generate data that can drive those workflows. So I want to pull data from a big Excel spreadsheet or even potentially an external data source. And the point of doing this is I need to push a large volume of transactions through the system, but I want to synthetically generate it because I do not want to use production data. If you use production data to test your environment at scale, you will run into GDPR and privacy concerns. This is something that is very hot within the test automation space right now, because many people realize that leveraging, in essence, production data, even if you go through some kind of masking process, is a very dangerous thing to do. And this is one of the things that often leads to kind of the security breaches and leaks of thousands of customer records that we read about online, what seems to be almost every month these days. And then lastly, what we want to be able to do here is to be able to simulate those external systems, again, using service virtualization that we mentioned a few moments ago, but not just for running different functional scenarios, not just for validating potential changes or changes in the payload or the data, but also to be able to mimic different performance characteristics. Those performance characteristics can help me understand if the functional behavior of my application or my robot is negatively affected due to changes in SLAs or changes in availability of those external systems. So I realize we're getting very close towards the end of our time today. So I'm actually going to just show you a handful of things very quickly. I'm going to show how we can trigger a workflow to test a bot. I'm going to show you how you can actually control your test environment, both a pre-production and a post-production environment. And then we're going to touch upon how we can use that test at scale. Now, we might run out of time, but at the end of today's webinar, you'll see that there's a landing page for you to click and schedule a consultation with one of our test automation experts. So if we want to go into any of this in more detail, we'll be able to do that during a one-on-one session. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to actually go to our Parasoft SOA test product, which is our functional test automation technology that really brings together both web UI validation as well as API validation, as well as listening to internal ESPs. Now I'm triggering an RPA process that is inside of Salesforce. Now, Salesforce has been misbehaving today, so we'll see if it wants to behave during today's webinar. This little hummingbird tries to peck the eyes out of the dog. It looks like we've moved forward okay there, so that's good news. So what this is doing is this is actually creating an invoice inside of Salesforce. Once it's done that, we've now triggered the process, and then what you'll see back in SOA test is you'll see the execution of the back-end workflows that are going on. So here in my central view, we're going to see, hopefully, there we go. We're going to see information that's coming back from the internals of that process. And we have a number of different steps set up here within SOA test. So here I've got my kicking off of my invoice process. And then here I've got a number of things which are actually pulling back different data associated with the internal workflows. Here I can see different steps that have gone through my different ESP workflow. Let's go ahead and just pick on a couple of interesting ones. Let me see if I can find there's a SOAP one here. So here I can see the internal XML data. Don't worry, it's not that scary. We'll talk about how we can put this into a human readable format. You'll also see data. This particular workflow is sending data over EDI. EDI is a data format used often within finance and healthcare industries. Very difficult to process that. It's a lot of fixed length messaging. What we can do inside of SOATest is actually take that data and bring it back to you and show you it in a more readable form. So what we can do is I can go here and I can look at the element view, and this is that same EDI data. It's actually showing me HIPAA, particular HIPAA payload, and we can see that it's in much more of a human readable form. And I can also create assertions or validations on each of those elements by simply selecting within my data view here and selecting what element that I wanted to validate inside of the of that payload. Now, this means that I can build my test. I can, obviously run through an individual scenario. I can also data drive that as well. So I could add a data source, pulling data from a variety of different processes or inputs, CSV, databases, internal tables, a whole bunch of different things here. This test can then actually be automated as well. So it can be executed from the command line, running in a truly headless mode, plugging in as part of a CI/CD process, and then aggregating that data up to a centralized dashboard. So this gives me the ability to create the test. It gives me the ability to drive the test. It gives me the ability to be able to validate the input. But how do I control my test environment? This is where we go to the web-based workspace for the Parasoft SOATest, as well as Parasoft Virtualize, which is our service virtualization technology. Here, if I go ahead and look at one of my test environments, you can see this is a visual representation of what that RPA process looks like. We can see that I've got the triggering of my Salesforce process. I've got the different steps that I go through on my workflow. And you can see that it's communicating with some external systems here as well. Here's where I have full control over my environment. So if I wanted to say, let's go ahead and look at what the production live environment looks like, I can see that I've got all of my backend instances are connected to live, and I can see that for some reason my accounting service, which was my Swift payload of a few moments ago, is actually failing. I could actually reconfigure this environment to run inside of a functional scenario where I have different available configurations for my backend systems. These cover both functional scenarios as well as performance-based scenarios. And then simply provisioning through this web UI would execute those tests within that environment based upon that configuration. You can then obviously configure the environment and configure it so that, for example, if I'm running inside of production, I can only run smoke tests versus my staged environment, where I could actually run different types of tests, smoke, performance, or even a complete functional regression. So I've got my tests, I've got them running inside of an environment that I can control. The third piece of the puzzle is how do I start running those tests at scale? This is where we can reuse those existing tests and the existing SOATest test artifact and create a performance test based upon that. So if I just navigate to where that particular file is, and I can use the different user scenarios within my test automation and execute those under load, creating different profiles and different test scenarios that allow me to run different use cases through my application, potentially running different types of data that's going through my workflow. And running that at different profiles or different distributions over time. This data all rolls up into a centralized reporting and analytics dashboard that includes not just pass-fail information, but we can also capture performance testing information as well into the dashboarding infrastructure. So as I said, that was a very, very quick demonstration, really just touching some of the key elements of Parasoft SOATest and Parasoft Virtualize. Parasoft SOA test is triggering the process, monitoring the internals, validating, and then scaling execution within pre-production through the use of performance testing. And service virtualization is used to isolate the test environment so I can control its behavior, model different unexpected test scenarios, and make this concept of continuous testing a reality, making sure that my tests are repeatable in an ongoing fashion. Now, as I said, that's a very, very quick demonstration. I think it's possibly the quickest demonstration I've ever done of Parasoft SOA test and virtualize. But if you guys would like to have a more detailed demonstration or a consultation with one of our team around how to apply test automation to your RPA process, please go ahead and hit this landing page and give us a little bit of information about your current challenges. And then we'll be able to kind of have one of our team meet you guys. Okay. Diego, I think we have a couple of minutes left for questions. I've got a couple here that, let's see, we've got more than a couple, but I'm actually going to just ask 2 or 3 of them. And I'm going to throw the first one actually at you while I read the rest of them. Which type of testing persona might be most appropriate for testing RPA?
Well, thanks, Mark. Great presentation. I think it depends a lot on the RPA system itself, right? I mean, the target persona for building RPA today is business, but you know, if that's the case, you might need a business testing persona, and therefore the environment will have to, the testing tool will have to support that, of course. But as this becomes more complex, more you know, at scale, at enterprise, I think getting IT involved, then, you know, look at your environment. You will need you know, you will need a technical tester, but there are also you know, if development needs to get involved, you could also have developers. I mean, in the testing world, we've got all 3 types of testing personas that today do some level of testing, and maybe in some cases it might be not just one, but it might be together. The business guy might want to test whatever you know, what he wants to test, but there's more complicated stuff that might need to be tested by a developer in the background.
I agree 100%. I think as the complexity rises, you really need to start looking at it in more and more detail. So I agree with you 100% on that. There's a couple of questions that actually touched upon things which we already said. So I'm going to knock one of those out really quickly. It says that with RPA, we build very simple solutions. Do we still need to test those? It all comes down to the business risk. If your business risk is in my matrix like medium or high, then yes, you should be testing them, even if they're simple. That's the bottom line. Did you anything to add to that, Diego? You think that's
no, I totally agree. I like that that slide.
Okay. And then actually there are 2 questions which are related. One that just came in and this other one here. So I'm going to actually read both of these. If I used a test automation tool to implement RPA, what should I look for? And then the other question is RPA better than Selenium, which has more scope in the future? And I think this talks directly to one of those things, which is the difference between test and RPA. So maybe we make this our closing question, and I'll let you go first, Diego.
Well, I think there's, you know, if you're just talking about doing some simple things, I think you can get away with the Selenium driver. I guess that's what she's referring to here. But at scale, I don't think that I don't think that Selenium wasn't built for that, and there's much more that RPA needs at scale, right? And if you look at those features, right, that I showed you in the Venn diagram, Selenium doesn't have all those stuff.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, it's like when you look at test automation versus RPA, they both have things which they do for their market. So Selenium being a test automation framework, it is very dedicated at the UI level. So if you've got a web UI, you can use Selenium to automate. So therefore you would say, well, that's the same as what I do with RPA. So let me just do the same thing. And when you talk about something simple, I would agree that Selenium would work, and especially if it's something simple at a low business risk. Where it breaks down is the scale, plus there are also some other things as well. So if Selenium doesn't work for some reason in a test environment, it's not that big of a deal, right? Okay, so test infrastructure is unstable. We're kind of in the software industry are happy, well, not happy with that, but accepting of it, and we try to minimize it. But if a test infrastructure is being used for RPA and it's unstable, then you've got massive business impact. The impact of a failure in an RPA workflow is much bigger than the impact in a test automation workflow. So your business risk is much, much higher when you use test automation for RPA workflows. Also, you're missing the auditing and governance concepts. So you don't necessarily know who did what, so you're gonna have to build that. As I said, Selenium specifically is a web UI testing technology, so it doesn't come into APIs, which are actually, RESTful APIs or headless interfaces are actually much more resilient to change as well. So really, if you've got a web UI that you're trying to do RPA on, you shouldn't really be doing it through the web UI. You should be doing it through backend services. UI-driven RPA is really reserved for those legacy systems where you only have access to a thick client UI. This obviously, as you can tell, is a soapbox of mine, which I could go on for a long time. So if you'd like us to follow up further, please go ahead and fill in the landing page. We'd be more than happy to have a follow-on conversation. I realize that with Diego that we've gone over. So thank you for staying on, folks. We still have pretty much everybody still on the session, so that is fantastic. Thank you. Obviously, it's a useful topic. Diego, thank you very much for presenting today. I think we've really kind of helped educate the audience, and I look forward to talking again soon on this topic.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks a lot for having me.
Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. The recording of this webinar will be available online. Again, reach out to us through this consultation page, especially if you would like access to the slides or something like that. Okay. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.